Good afternoon and welcome to NFRC's Sustainability Future, Building a Sustainable Future, Macro to Micro. My name is Jeremy Browning and I am NFRC's Sustainability Manager. Last week we kicked off the series with future weather files. Now we're going down to the ground level to explore how the built environment is responding to climate change. We're excited to host session 2, George Mason University's Path to Net Zero by 2050 or sooner. Presented by George Mason's Director of University Sustainability, Greg Farley. Greg is a passionate advocate for sustainability and the environment with over 25 years of experience in sustainability and higher education. He's also an award-winning teacher with a long history of innovation and effectiveness in the classroom and has taught biology, zoology, and environmental science at various institutions, including Duke University and Chesapeake College. Additionally, he studied at the Sustainable Living Institute of Maui with a focus on rural colleges and how all aspects of sustainability can affect communities it serves. As Director of Sustainability for George Mason, Greg oversees the university's efforts to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 or sooner. Today's Greg is going to discuss specifically about how the campus is reducing its carbon footprint in the built environment. So a little housekeeping before we begin. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. We encourage you to ask questions, so please use the chat box or a question box to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So thank you, Greg Farley, for joining us today, and I'm going to switch the presentation mode over to you.
All right, well, Jeremy, thanks for the introduction. I ask you all to bear with for a second while we get us rolling here with the presentation. And 5, 3, 1, and I think we're up and running. So quick tech check, but are you folks seeing the slides or are you seeing the navigation panel?
So we're still seeing the navigation panel.
All right, so let me switch this here. And I think this fixed the problem last time. So you should be seeing my slides at this point, right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me in. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with y'all. This is a great speaker series. I took some time to watch last week's presentation on climate change, and you guys got a pretty thorough lesson in that. So, I think I'd like you to view this afternoon's presentation as kind of a follow-on. That is, so now that we know all this about climate, what are we doing to plan for it? What are we doing as an institution and across higher ed more broadly to try and mitigate the worst effects of this and to make sure that we're part of the solution and not part of the problem. So as Jeremy said, my name is Greg Farley. Little housekeeping just on my end. I know that, so I grew up in Boston. That sometimes means I talk really fast. And so if you need to interrupt me at any time, please, feel free to break in or message Jeremy and have him interrupt me, and I'm happy to clarify at any point. I'm also happy for questions at any point. I've left lots of time at the end of this for Q&A, but if there's something you want to discuss in context, certainly we can do that as well. So a little bit about sort of where we're going today. I want to give you just a little background on sort of Mason and our Office of Sustainability and what we do for the institution. We'll talk briefly about sort of what climate and carbon neutrality means to the university and what we're doing about our carbon footprint. And then because y'all are building scientists and window experts in particular, I sort of tried to winnow the talk down to focus in on what we need to do with our built environment and to talk about sort of high performance buildings, what that means for our fenestration choices going forward, language we're already beginning to see that I think differentiates our fenestration requests from past requests. And then finally, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed the conversation, especially about outside air in buildings, about turnover rates, what this means for sort of energy strategy for buildings, and again, with a focus on fenestration going forward. So hopefully that sort of takes us about 25 minutes or so, and we'll sort of roll forward from there. And again, feel free to break in with questions as we go.
Real quick, Greg, before you continue, do you want to do this with your camera on?
Oh, I could do that, sure. All right, so now y'all can see me. Hi, everybody. All right, so just a little bit about George Mason. We are the largest public research university in Virginia by enrollment. We've got about 38,000 students or so. We're a little different from other big R1 institutions, though, in that we are not an entirely residential campus. We feel much more like a community college. Our students tend to live off campus. They have jobs and families and lives in the community, and we are part of their sort of day-to-day. We have about 6,000 students living on campus, and most of those are our first-year students. They come to us from all over the place, 130 countries and all 50 states. We offer over 200 degrees across the undergraduate and graduate levels. We are sort of running just a little bit south of $200 million in sponsored research over the past year, and that's grants coming in for research programs across a wide variety of faculty interests, from social sciences to computer science and engineering. We're trying very hard to be a very innovative institution and yet deliver a really good value for our undergraduates, and we're pretty happy with some of the statistics at the bottom side of the screen here. And then I think that last note is really interesting, and we track this very carefully, but you know, more than 8 out of 10 of our graduates are employed within 6 months of graduation. And we're super proud of this because there are not a lot of institutions that can say that with this kind of confidence. So what we're trying to do is to prepare students really well for the practical implications of joining the workforce very soon, and trying to prepare them for how the world and the workforce are going to interact in a climate changed future. We are in Virginia. Most of you will, if you're familiar with us, will be familiar with our Fairfax campus. That's sort of our main campus. 2 other large campuses, though. There's one in downtown Arlington. We'll talk about that one more later today. It's another one out in Manassas in Prince William County. That's our science and technology campus. And then there are a couple of smaller facilities scattered around the state. There's a Smithsonian joint facility that we run courses in conservation biology and landscape ecology out here. A couple of small facilities down on the Potomac River. And then also we have a global campus in South Korea, which is really sort of an interesting and somewhat new asset for the institution. Just to give you a flavor for sort of what our capital projects look like, the one on the far right-hand side of the screen here is mostly built. We anticipate taking sort of possession of this one. It's actually mislabeled. This one's on the Fairfax campus. We anticipate taking possession of that one late next year. Horizon Hall is that one on the right. So the photograph between the middle and the right should be switched here. The Life Sciences and Engineering building on the Science and Tech campus in Prince William County in Manassas is the one that's in the center. That one is still under design. Both of those will meet LEED Silver criteria, and we're trying to do this with an eye to sort of overall building performance and energy sort of minimization within the buildings. And then super exciting for us is this proposed building for Arlington next door to the law school and the public policy school. We'll talk a great deal more about this. You'll see several artists' renderings of this building going forward. You notice that all of them are going to be really heavy on sort of how we use windows and what those mean for the quality and character of the interior spaces in the building. Within our office, so the Office of Sustainability at Mason lives in the Facilities Department, which is, you know, somewhat typical for higher education. And, you know, we define sustainability as a very people-forward process in our office. So we are really interested in making the world a better place for people, rather than being, you know, sort of a close cover for environmentalism, which I think is a very strong trend in sustainability offices. So we focus hard on creating opportunities for our students, for creating opportunities for students of color, for creating opportunities and equity across different programs and different interest groups. And broadly, these green boxes here correspond to sort of the 4 sort of major axes that our office works along. We've got one program manager who works mostly on efficiency for the campus, and so she's very integrated into our conversations about energy efficiency, zero waste and recycling, how we bring students to campus and faculty, and alternative transportation. And then she's also sort of our analysis and reporting guru. We have a second program manager who runs our greenhouse and gardens program. This is super unique for Mason. We are, as far as I know, one of a very small handful of institutions that manages to grow food on the campus and move it into campus dining halls And so our program manager for Greenhouse and Gardens has been super successful about that. She's the longest running member of our team. She's been with us for almost a decade now. We have a $100,000 Patriot Green Fund. This is also pretty unique for Mason. This is a facilities line item where students and faculty can apply for research funding to do projects that advance sustainability for the campus facilities. And so projects in this vein have included everything from greening up buildings to creating a solar kiosk outside the main administration building, to planting meadows in place of lawns and putting trees back in the ground in places where historically they were removed. We're actually in the process now of funding an arboretum project for the campus that will lead us to certification for the campus as a Tree Campus USA, which should be a really cool project. And then finally, we've got one sort of program manager whose job is sort of education and outreach. He's our social media person, he's our media contact person, and is actually responsible for me being here this afternoon. So a big shout out to our education and outreach program person. If you want to know what all of that looks like in practice, I'd invite you to visit our webpage. That's green.gmu.edu. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll find a link to this interactive GIS map of everything that we're able to put our fingers on about a year ago and make it explicit in place. Each one of these pins will have a little pop-up box that'll tell you what's going on at that site. But it runs the gamut from our LEED certified buildings to free bike checkouts to places where we grow food to places that host honeybee hives. It's actually a really interesting way to get around. Side note, if you're ever visiting the Fairfax campus and you get lost on campus, this interactive tool is the only one that will tell you where you are and how to get where you want to go. So again, green.gmu.edu and the interactive sustainable Mason map is a really good tool. We do get involved in teaching a little bit. We are not an academic enterprise. We are a facilities enterprise. But we host right now a living learning community, which is a group of students in a residence hall who have made sustainability the theme of their academic and residential experience on campus for the year. And we both administer and teach in that program. Our Greenhouse and Gardens manager is teaching an undergraduate course in sustainable food systems right now. And then I am actually co-teaching a course with one of our environmental science and policy faculty on carbon and climate action planning this semester. And we'll talk more a little bit about that later on. But this last box is really important because what this says to us is that we are trying really hard to roll our students into these planning processes, to give them ownership of the campus's sustainability efforts and to give them sort of a leadership stake in suggesting what the university should pursue. So with that as the background about Mason and about the Office of Sustainability and what we do, I want to sort of launch a little bit into, so what is climate neutrality and what does that mean for Mason? And I know y'all saw this particular figure last week in the presenter who did the climate change talk. And I just, a brief recap of that talk to me reads like this: climate is already changing. We are probably committed to something just about a degree, maybe a little more of warming, even if we could stop carbon emissions today. So we need to begin the process of both adapting to that and ceasing emissions. Let's not make the problem any worse. We know what the cause of this is. We can do the isotope chemistry. We can trace the sources of these emissions. And we know that carbon dioxide, methane, and a bunch of other gases that are present on college campuses and in commercial buildings worldwide are really the principal causes of this, right? And so just to take an ownership piece here, Mason is not innocent, right? We do have a carbon footprint. We do emit greenhouse gases as part of our day-to-day operations, but you have to heat the building, you have to keep the lights on. So what does carbon neutrality mean for us, and how do we eliminate our contributions to greenhouse gases? And why do this, and why the hurry up, right? And I just wanted to draw your attention real quick to the IPCC's report on 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the top bullet point here. The basic take home from this report in 2018 was we just have another decade before we bypass any chance at all of keeping warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, right? That's about 3 degrees, a little bit more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit. And it really implies some very, very uncomfortable things for future climate patterns and therefore for future local weather. So we really need to decarbonize before we emit another 10 years worth of greenhouse gases. That's the big take home. And Mason and other institutions across the university and college landscape, nationally and internationally, are really starting to grapple hard with this, because the IPCC draws on the research that we do as an institution. It's a compendium of global climate change research from across the literature. And we have faculty members at Mason who are contributing to that, both in the social sciences and in the earth and ecosystem sciences. And so we know our own faculty are telling us we need to do something. And our faculty are becoming more vocal about this as we go forward. At the end of the day, what does it all mean? Why do you need to even care about this? And I think at the end, it boils down to the fact that the Earth itself will still be here, but the ecosystems that support human economic activity will be disrupted. And if we let climate change run to 2 degrees C, these numbers are from the 4th National Climate Assessment that the US government puts out. And you're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars a year in multiple categories in economic losses, that if we do some things now, we can shrink these numbers a little bit. We can make this easier to deal with. We can make it less expensive. Failure to deal with the root problem is going to be more expensive and harder to adapt to down the road. So the sooner we start moving on this, the better we're going to be. And the built environment is a major contributor to this. Some 30 to 38%, depends on whose numbers you read, of carbon emissions in the United States are directly attributable to our building stock. So we know there's room for improvement in our buildings. We know there's room for improvement in how those buildings use and manage energy. Certainly windows are one piece of that, in addition to HVAC gear and fuel sources coming into the building and commuting and all the rest of those things. But I, for one, would like to see the temperature-induced estimates for human mortality fall a great deal, because behind this number are lots and lots and lots of people. And as an office that concentrates on the people forward, the definition for sustainability, I would like to see these numbers shrink a great deal. So what have we been doing so far, and how have we been doing it? Well, our office is coming up on, I think, 13 years old. In 2007, alongside about 500 other institutions, Mason signed an instrument called the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, the ACUPCC. The ACUPCC asked institutions to choose a time to become climate neutral and to choose and design a mechanism by which we would do that. The best science at the time suggested that we had lots of room to run with this, right? That we had a little bit of time to think and a little bit of time to plan before we started doing. And unfortunately, over the last decade, the science has really shown us that that early estimate was pretty generous, and that the time envelope for climate neutrality has been constrained a great deal. So we wrote a climate action plan in 2010. In the middle there, we also invested an awful lot of money in an energy savings contract for the institution that saves us about $2.5 million a year in energy. We are committed to the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest collective sustainability initiative. There's a reference to that in the sheet that Jeremy will send out. You're more than welcome to sort of go look at those on your own, but the principles of the UN Global Compact are guiding what we do as an institution. We are doing enough on our campus that we are rated gold by ASHE Stars. ASHE is the higher education clearinghouse for sustainability programming, both academically and operationally. They have a 4-tiered ranking system. It's sort of like LEED. You can be stars certified, you can be stars silver, gold, or platinum. There are only about 10 platinum schools right now, and there's only a double handful of gold schools, maybe 22 or something like that. And so the ASHE Stars Gold ranking means that we're as far as our relative position to other higher ed institutions, we're moving ahead fairly aggressively. And this is not just carbon neutrality, but sort of sustainability more broadly. What are we teaching in our classrooms? How are we doing with water stewardship? And what are we doing with our stormwater and wastewater resources? Things like that. And then at the moment, so I was hired in the beginning of 2020. I was hired in February, about a month before COVID-19 sent us all to do things like this from home. But we're in the process of creating a Mason Sustainability Council to sort of guide strategic thinking and strategic sustainability planning for the university, with an eye towards finding the sweet spot, really the overlap between what we teach our students and how we use our campus. Trying to create a living learning laboratory from the campus to make the campus an opportunity for our faculty to do research close to home, to make our classrooms and our students aware of what the best practices are, and sort of find all those ways in which research and teaching and operations can overlap. And that's going to be super exciting over the next couple of years. In a very practical sense, what climate neutrality means for us, though, is that we have to eliminate or offset some 120,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases. And that's expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents here. There are a lot of other contributing gases to this, but we have to find a way to eliminate 120,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide impact on the global atmosphere. That's going to be a tall order. What you're looking at here is our historical carbon footprint from 2006 through fiscal year 2017. For those of you familiar with carbon footprints, the black line on the bottom here, total scope 1, that's direct combustion on our campus. That's basically the footprint of our central heating and cooling plant that's fired by natural gas. There's a couple other minor contributors to that. The scope 2, this green line here, is our purchased electricity. And you'll notice that we are definitely rising in our electricity demand from the grid. And then scope 3 is pretty much everything else. So this is university-sponsored travel, for example. This is our waste footprint. This is the contributions from food. And you notice that we are getting more efficient in those sorts of categories, with the overall impact that, our greenhouse gas emissions actually dipped a little bit between 2013 and 2014, and then started to climb again. What you're looking at in this end of the graph here on the right is that we've been busy building things, and we seem to be building bigger and more aggressively as years have gone on. You'll note that at the end of the 2008 real estate crisis and the recession, that our emissions really sort of plateaued. And then we started building again, and we've really sort of bumped up since that point. So we've got to bring this line to 0. The good news is we're getting smarter. We're doing this in better and better ways, right? So our total carbon footprint, this sort of gross emissions line here at the top, if you normalize per 1,000 square feet, is actually down. And it's down by a not insignificant amount. We'll get to that on the next slide. But this means we're building more efficient buildings. There are other contributing factors. You notice that all of these fell on a per square foot basis. So some of this is simple arithmetic. If you add enough floor space, the number per 1,000 square feet is going to go down. Your denominator is larger, right? But the overall trend here is that we are building smarter. We are commuting smarter. We're beginning to make progress on some of these things. And we're creeping back up a little bit here towards the end, but we still haven't approached the carbon intensity that we had when we first started this process over a decade ago. This is a sort of campus highlight slide that's getting a little bit beyond us at this point. But the numbers to pay attention to are, our greenhouse gas emissions are down almost a third per square foot. And that's been a real sort of accomplishment that we'd like to highlight as an institution. This means that our buildings are getting more efficient, right? Our built environment is using less energy per unit area. And likewise, even as our student population has grown, we are almost 1/5 more efficient now than we were in prior years, just based on sort of our enrollment data. So this means we're building more space, we're bringing in more students, but we're not doing it at the same carbon intensity we were in 2006. I think that's really encouraging. We have bought, some renewable energy, and we will continue to explore that. This number is a little bit old now. We've actually now relamped something like 19 NBA basketball courts worth of floor space, and that is saving us a good deal of money. The transition between incandescents and LEDs has been very good for George Mason. So we do have an existing carbon action plan or climate action plan. Both terms are sort of interchangeable, right? It was written in 2010. It was actually student sourced at the time. It was written by a professor with the cooperation from the students in the class. And they laid out a timeline relative to a 2006 baseline to try and gently ratchet us down. So by 2014, we're supposed to show a 10% reduction. By 2020, we were supposed to show a 20% reduction. And just to skip back for a second, you'll note that we haven't really accomplished that. This number's gone up rather than down. So wholesale, we're kind of moving in the wrong direction, but at least we had the goals. The other thing that setting goals allowed us to do was to set a target date and a final sort of greenhouse gas reduction target number. And at the time, the literature suggested that if we cut our carbon emissions by 80% by mid-century, that we would be meaningfully contributing to reduction in greenhouse gases at a global scale and helping to stave off the worst effects of warming. New research tells us that this is really out of line with modern expectations. This number really needs to be 2030, and this number needs to be almost complete reduction in our greenhouse gas profile. So one of the efforts that I think you'll see Mason look at very critically over the next 6 months or so is, should we make an official reduction goal of 100% by 2030? And then how are we going to do that? Because that's going to be a really, really uphill climb for us. It can be done. It has been done at other schools, but it's going to require us to rededicate, I think, both some resources, some intellectual resources, some human resources, as well as to take a really critical look at how we use the standing stock of buildings that we have. Fortunately, the number one strategy we planned on using 10 years ago was to look at building efficiency and building performance, and we're making strides in that. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into carbon footprints, and we can talk about that in the Q&A session later on. But I really want to focus in on what we're trying to do with our buildings. And I want to give you a sneak peek at the new idea building proposed for Arlington, because I think that represents kind of the cutting edge of what Mason is thinking about the conversations we're having internally about how we should construct buildings with energy and resilience in mind. And so without further ado, we could walk through some of this, but this is all sort of sub-strategies under building performance, right? And engage partners for building automation systems, install variable frequency drives. How do we look at geothermal resources and use those to draw down the energy that our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems use? And certainly on this list is, what do we do with fenestration? Lots of energy enters buildings through windows, lots of energy leaves buildings through windows. So how do we do this, right? And I think the realization we're coming to is right now we're a state institution. The state mandates that we build to a LEED Silver criterion, and LEED Silver these days is really not super progressive. LEED Silver is pretty much kind of what you find in a standard building code, as long as you use LED lights, right? And that's a little bit of an overstatement, and no disrespect to the good folks at US Green Building Council. They are pulling LEED forward and making it more aggressive with every passing iteration of it, but we need to get out ahead of this. We need to realize that for us, and for climate generally, LEED Silver is not going to get us to where we need to go. So what about LEED Platinum? And so this is, I want to take the next couple of slides and sort of talk through the concept for the home for our new sort of tech venture in Arlington, right? This is planned out. There is an RFP on the street, and we are receiving responses to that RFP for a 360,000 square foot building that'll be a public-private partnership. And the idea behind the building is to put our students and our researchers in the same space with high-tech companies so that the cross-pollination between industry and academia can really benefit both what academia is trying to work on in terms of questions we're trying to answer. It also allows our students direct exposure to the challenges of kind of real life beyond the university, the challenges that exist in the private sphere, opportunities for collaboration, opportunities for internships and employments, all kinds of things like that. So this is explicitly a P3 project with a really heavy emphasis on tech forward thinking. And this is at least partially planned in response to Amazon's relocation, or Amazon's new location for their HQ2 in Northern Virginia. We're hoping that we can draw their attention and bring some of our graduates and our faculty to bear on some of the infrastructure needs that Amazon is going to develop in this area. In terms of the energy profile we'd like to see from the building, I draw your attention to the fourth bullet point down here. This is explicitly planned as a net zero energy project. That is not entirely a firm requirement in the RFP, but it is in there as a preferred requirement. The RFP does require LEED Platinum for building design and construction, and it sets this, what seems to me to be a really, really low energy use intensity number of 13.3 kBTU per square foot on an annual basis. And to generate this number, we went back to a set of standards for architecture 2030, and they are calling for buildings in 2025 to have a 90% reduction over ASHRAE code. So for those of you who are familiar with ASHRAE, familiar with building codes, if this number looks really small to you, that's because it is. It's a 90% reduction from what ASHRAE code is calling for right now. And so we have made that an explicit condition of the development. In addition to designing for efficiency, we also took a look at what climate projections bring for changes in weather to Northern Virginia. And we want to design the building to be a refuge for extreme heat and heat waves, and to be able to withstand, and rather than sort of sheet off and dismiss and try and treat it as a problem to get rid of, to be able to capture and reuse sort of precipitation from extreme events. And so there's more to be said about that as well. And again, that's really not germane to today's talk. I can take questions in the Q&A if you'd like. But in the RFP, the language says the project will explicitly incorporate state-of-the-art smart and green building technologies and advanced cyber infrastructure. And so part of the goal here too is to use this facility to teach Amazon and other high-tech partners what's possible with building science, so that we help pull the sort of the corporate sector along and try and green almost the entire ecosystem for high-tech academia and high-tech workspaces all at the same time, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about how, you know, COVID has really altered this conversation. Certainly it caused a lot of us in green buildings to sort of, you know, stop and scratch our heads a bit. Downtown in Arlington, our Arlington campus includes our law school and our public policy school, as well as the building that's the home to our foundation. So this is Fairfax Drive here, going right through downtown Arlington. The building's about halfway between the Virginia Square Metro stop and the Clarendon Metro stop, for those of you who are familiar with the area. This is a derelict building that's not in use right now, so we're actually going to take this one down, do some site improvements, and then we're planning the IDIA building to go up on that site. I think I said most of this already. Lots of space here for co-working tenants, for potential partners to the institution, right? Some retail space that's open to the public. And so there are certainly spaces within this building that are going to need fresh air. They're going to need high incidence of natural light, things that stimulate creative thinking, to keep people on their feet and awake during meetings, to keep people sort of feeling energized during the day. So the building is explicitly being designed in some ways to make sure that we bring the outside inside as much as we can without sacrificing the energy trade-offs that often come with that. Flip side of that is that there certainly will be spaces inside the building for research that might not want outside light, that might not want outside noise, things like that. So there will be some spaces that are isolated. You're looking at a second potential artist graphic rendering of the thing here. But in the RFP, it explicitly calls for a glazing ratio of 40% minimum. And it calls explicitly for 75% of occupied spaces to have direct exterior views. And so that's going to, I think, be an interesting challenge. This building kind of sits in a canyon. And so we're going to have to try and shape the building appropriately, and then make sure we use the right kind of window patterning and glazing to bring light and views into those inside spaces. Interestingly, this is the first RFP I have ever read that explicitly calls for triple glazing. Certainly it's the first one we've done for Mason that includes this. This is a sea change in the way the university is thinking about building energy and building performance. I think probably most of you, this will come as no surprise, but usually we build buildings, almost to bottom bid, right? And so triple glazing is more expensive. It represents an upfront cost that we have to argue with the state about. But the idea here is if we do it right and we build the envelope the right way, and we do what your organization tells us is the best thing to do for energy management in our windows, that we'll get that money back over the life cycle of the building, probably in multiples, by making sure that our windows are as energy efficient as they can be. There are also notes in the RFP, again, not hard requirements, but preferences for electrochromic window glazing for high performance windows. So I think there's some cool tech that we'd like to see incorporated into this structure so that we make sure that the inside spaces are well lit. There's really no guidance in the building specs themselves in the RFP about whether those windows need to be operable or not. But we are asking contractors and proposers to select either a Fitwel 2.1 certification for occupant health or a RELI 2.0. Fitwel calls for operable shading, right? But RELI actually calls for operable windows. And so this is a difference, I think, a divergence in sort of the design credits as designed. Fitwel is designed to complement CDC criteria, and it was designed with input from the city and the state of New York. And so you can imagine that people in downtown New York City might have some, some very particular ideas about outdoor air quality, which are probably not entirely unjustified. But RELI, which draws from the U.S. Green Building Council and the LEED matrix, actually explicitly calls for operable windows. Given that we've called for a LEED Platinum standard on this building and certification to LEED Platinum, I think we will probably end up with contractors that are interested in pursuing RELI over Fitwel, which might leave us with an opportunity for operable windows. I'm not an organizational performance person, right? I'm a sort of a building technology geek, but I did run across, this is an interesting paper if you have a chance to read it. Again, there's a reference in the materials that Jeremy will send out. But you can actually use the structure itself to make people feel more satisfied about the air quality in their office if they get to open their window. It's actually a pretty strong pattern in the data that Brager et al. Bring forward. So I'm a big fan of allowing folks to open their windows. I think it has to be smart. I think the building has to answer to air quality alerts, and it has to answer to outdoor temperature and humidity and enthalpy. But there's definitely, I think, an understanding that if we allow people to sort of monkey with their own windows, as it were, then we will have fewer complaints about indoor building air quality, temperature control, things of that nature. So trying to sort of herd the university in that direction. Stay tuned in. I'll keep you updated. Third rendering here, one other potential way that we might think about arranging glazing on the building. COVID has really turned this conversation upside down. Mason is currently running all of our buildings as single pass, huge numbers of air changes, bringing in enormous volumes of outside air, treating that air for humidity and filtering it before it gets into the building, and then one pass and out. And although I think the idea is that we will go back to more standard building operations once there's a vaccine and the world sort of returns to whatever new normal will approach, I think we probably need to plan for the next one of these. My background is in biology, and this epidemic or pandemic was not unexpected, and it was not improbable. Historically, the data show that about every 30 years, we should expect some sort of pandemic to sweep through the global population. We're very fortunate that we haven't had one for, say, probably over 60 years at this point. So we sort of got used to not thinking about that. And so I think the mantra of sort of build tight and ventilate right may still hold, but it is going to require, I think, a little more careful thought about pulling air through buildings, what outdoor air contributes to indoor building occupant health, things of that nature. Better filtration, more aggressive filtration, different mechanisms for doing that. But pulled into all of this is, do we design buildings in the future to give occupants the right to open their own windows? Certainly there are building certifications like living buildings that require that. Otherwise you can't be living building certified. So I think there are a whole host of questions that are going to need to be settled out. We've kind of got emergency plans and emergency measures in place right now. ASHRAE has issued guidance, Fitwel has issued guidance, USGBC has issued guidance. But I think in terms of the long-term impact on building design and building planning, there's still a long way to go in this. And I think, you know, to a nod to sort of folks in your line of work, both in Windows and in other building components, we're going to need to show data to really get you know, sort of building designers to understand and to start incorporating new ideas. I believe very, very, very strongly, and maybe this is just the scientist in me, but I believe that good data has the ability not only to tell a story about what's happening now, but to help us project with some probability what's going to happen in the future, what the future needs of a structure are going to be. So I wanted to just sort of a tip of the hat to all of you who work on the data for window performance, and to tell you that I think that's going to become even more important going forward and more vital to the future of building design. So please keep doing what you're doing, and you know, we rely on good information to make good decisions. I'll wrap it there. I'm happy to entertain questions, to have a little discussion as we go through. If you need to get in touch with us, Jeremy has a handout with all this information, so don't rush for the screenshot. I think we can get this information to you. But basically, everything is green.gmu.edu at some level. We're, you know, our Go Green. My personal email, gfarley@gmu.edu. And if you're a social media user, you can find us on all the sort of major platforms at Green GMU.